Hello, dear listener. Just before you start listening to this episode, I would like to pay your attention that this episode will be a little bit different compared to the previous Future Procurement episodes. Here we will discuss corruption and unethical behavior in procurement. This topic is very serious, and I really want you to spread this message across and to share this episode with as many people as you can in procurement and outside. Thank you so much and enjoy your listening. Hello and welcome to Future Procurement Podcast. My name is Robert Freeman, and today we probably have the last part or the last episode of our best practice series together with Margaret Gilbert, consultant, trainer and author of Contract Matters books covering procurement, and she's with us on the direct call from New Zealand. Hello, Margaret.
Hello there, how are you?
It's great that, Margaret, you have raised this topic about unethical behaviors in procurement, and you really want to give some of new perspectives maybe to all of us from both buyer and supplier side, which you were experiencing in your career. So, Margaret, can you start with saying what is the big picture that you see about this one when you compare different experiences you had in different parts of the world, in different environments?
Sure. Overall, I think mostly is that procurement is done reasonably well. However, saying that, for both buyer and supplier, there are some issues, and there are parts of the world that do it better than others. I think that we should, in terms of this podcast, look at it from the perspective of three areas really. One is unethical behavior, one is procurement fraud, and the third is corruption. So it's on a kind of a continuum. So it's sort of like unethical behavior at one end and fraud in the middle, so to speak, and corruption at the other end. It's interesting when the procurement rules has some principles attached, and those principles are the need for transparency and fairness and accountability, etc. Those are three of the procurement principles. But it's interesting that sometimes the words are there, but the actions don't follow. And I think there are some parts of the world, as I said, that don't do so great. And I won't name specific countries, but I'll name continents. For example, Africa doesn't do very well in lots of ways, but equally the same thing with parts of Asia. And every country thinks that it does okay, but I'm sure we were talking before about the Transparency International Corruption Index, which outlines all the countries and where they are in terms of being most corrupt or least corrupt. Yeah. And I'm from New Zealand, and I'm proud to say that we're pretty much there on the top of the list as being the least corrupt country in the world. And I have found as I've gone out and done work in other parts of the world that what I've taken for granted as the way we do things here is not necessarily the way it's done elsewhere. And, you know, you've got to be clear and take with you the values and the procurement principles and to act that way wherever you are, even if their way is different from your way. Because the procurement principles of transparency and fairness and accountability is more than words. They are actually actions as well. You've got to live it, so to speak. Yeah. I think it's also interesting that sometimes people take some actions that they don't necessarily know that they're doing it wrong. I can say that in terms of suppliers, for example, who sometimes provide things such as like pens and calendars and morning teas and stuff like that, and when they're told they shouldn't do that, they don't, so they're teachable. But there are some people who take it further than that, and and so the question is at what point do you cross the line? And once you've crossed the line, how do you come back from that line? How do you come back to the good side rather than going over to the bad, so to speak? And that is difficult. And it's that once you've crossed that line, that's when you're starting to head in terms of, further down that continuum line of procurement fraud and corruption and stuff like that. So it's, some countries it's considered to be systemic, but I don't think that's a reason for it to be accepted. Because, if everyone stood up and said, no, we should be doing things ethically and getting rid of the unethical behaviour, if everyone did that, then there wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, but also what we discussed a little bit before we push the record button, I mean, ethics is probably unmeasurable thing, of course, and it's quite, should we say, subjective, but it's different perception of what is ethical and what is unethical in different cultures, in different countries. Even within one country, it could be big differences. So, of course, now we compare different countries between each other or different cultures between each other. You even say about the continents. I mean, of course, one size doesn't fit all, but at the same time, I think where the conflict of perceptions happens is when we come from one culture to another culture, and some of the things, let's face it, looks shocking or looks very unusual to me, for example, if I just go through my experience when I come to suppliers and they're coming with a enormous dinner in the restaurant with some special event or whatever, with some super expensive hotels and everything, and you are running the RFQ where this supplier is one of the players. I mean,
yes,
to me it looks ridiculous. It looks like really come on. And but of course, if we talk Middle East countries, if we talk, maybe you mentioned Africa,
yes,
I mean, for them, I understand that in their culture, maybe it is a good gesture and it's a part of like act of hospitality or being a good host. But so where is the border?
Yeah, it's tricky. But I think most people know what's right and wrong. I really do. And I think, and considering within procurement rules and regs and legislation and all the rest of it, it is pretty clear as to what is acceptable and what is not. And, if you're going to follow the procurement principles, which we should, then, then you'll know if it's wrong. You would know. I would rather walk away from something, and I have done that, than continue and feel like, when your gut feel is telling you there's something just a bit iffy here. You know what I mean? Or whether there's sort of some suggestion that money should change hands, for example. This is, there's no way that is right. Absolutely no way.
And I think if we talk about best practice today in our podcast, let's give the good advice in such cases. And it was actually this kind of advice which you just said, Margaret, was given to me that time with from a senior person who was traveling with me on that project, on that RFQ that we made. And it was exactly as you said. It was saying a big thank you for your hospitality and everything. Don't find us rude. First, I was planning to say that I'm tired and I'm leaving, but he said it very straightforward. Yes. He said, "Gentlemen," it was only gentlemen that time in that country, dealing with us. He said, "Gentlemen, sorry, but this is not following our ethics principles, and I believe that if we will cooperate together and if we find the common ground on this contract, then you would not repeat this kind of hospitality acts, because it's not acceptable in our company. And at the same time, I ask you what I really liked," he said, "to save this money and to put them better in decreasing the prices, or reducing the cost, let's say. If this is budgeted in your company, please, then you can count that this money can be saved for our contracts, and you can rather invest it in better prices.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. I think it's just a matter of being very clear about what is acceptable and what is not. And you can do that from the buyer side. You can do that in terms of if it's going to be a start of a tender process going forward, is to be clear about what is acceptable and what is not, and what won't accept, etc. Or if you've already got a relationship with a supplier, then you should already be known what is acceptable, what is not. If these new players come along, it doesn't take much to say, okay, what is acceptable, what is not. It could be sometimes useful to, if you've got a code of conduct or you've got, something like that, then provide them the code of conduct. That's one way. So you're doing your bit by saying what we consider acceptable. So, the other thing you can do, and what I've often done, is include it as a part of ethical practices, and include it perhaps as a part of evaluation criteria.
Exactly.
I think you've got to provide the vision. From a buyer side of the fence, you've got to provide the vision in terms of saying what is considered acceptable and what is not, and being clear on that, and being able to communicate that. From the supplier side is they need to listen, and sort of if they hear that this is not acceptable in any situation, certainly not during a bid process, then don't do it, And I would like to think, and unfortunately it doesn't happen too often, that the code of conduct also needs to have consequences. So in other words, if the code is not followed, there should be consequences that are actually put in place if something is a little bit iffy. Yeah. Excusing my New Zealand word here. Because there's no point having a code of conduct if it doesn't have consequences. Yeah. And the other thing is that perception is an interesting thing, and so you've got to be seen, and procurement needs to be looking at get our own house in order. So it's not seen or thought to be that it's sort of like that we can be approached and offered things. Yeah, exactly. So it's a way you behave and the way you present yourself, I think, is pretty important.
After some of events which were not really pleasant in my organization, it was both my employees, or like the department, everyone in the department were signing this code of conduct, which was, again, very simple rules, very obvious rules, but I mean, still by signing it, you just say to me, or you just say to your organization that you understand in the same way as I understand, because of these different perceptions of what is ethical, what is not ethical. We just put it in written, and by signing, you read it through, you really understand it, and you say, of course it is obvious. And then I'm more calm. And then again, as you said about the consequences, and you have the moral right to say that you have said okay to following these rules, you have broken these rules, sorry. Yeah. And the same thing I asked to be signed by every supplier that started the business with any of companies I was working for after some of the events, as I say. So especially for small and medium-sized companies, it's not that obvious that some things like this are important. However, the problems, let's say like this, with corruption and with the unethical behaviors of some particular employees is happening, I think, not less often with such companies compared to the big corporations or big size companies. So I mean, if for big size companies or for international, especially corporations, it is like a part of the culture to have this kind of big procedures and to have this code of conduct, as an example. For smaller and medium-sized companies, it is not that common. At least I haven't seen so many of the companies. I don't remember any actually which had it from the very beginning. But it is important. It is important.
If it's a part of your procurement principles, or generally speaking procurement principles, then whether you're a small organisation or large, it should be those issues of accountability and transparency and fairness should be known. So I don't think there can ever be a situation where you can say, I didn't know.
Exactly.
Maybe I'm being a bit hard. I don't know. I don't think so. But I think it's a big problem worldwide, and something has to happen to, pull it back, so to speak, so that procurement is carried out in a transparent way.
Yeah.
I mean, most organisations have a policy that says you can accept things up to $40, or using my New Zealand currency, $40 or $50 or whatever. And as long as that's not, and that's usually calendars and that sort of stuff, and a bottle of wine at Christmas time and things like that, and that's considered acceptable in the New Zealand environment. And what I used to do when I was a buyer and I had staff, I never accepted anything, and I always redistributed to my staff at Christmas time. So, there are instances when we've even been known to send things back.
Exactly.
So you've got to set your measure, so to speak, as to what you'll accept and what you won't.
Yeah, and especially it's I think a good hint for the managers, for the procurement leaders, is to show a good example, and that's much more powerful. I mean, than just signing any of the code of conduct or anti-corruption rules, or however you call it. If you just show by your example how the things can be done, how the things should be done, I think this gives the biggest effect.
Yes, and I'm wondering whether, in fact, it's over the years there's been talk about having a name and shame type scenario of suppliers that are not performing the way they should be, and unethical behaviour and stuff like that. There's another point of view that says you shouldn't name and shame. But you've got to, some action has to happen, because otherwise it'll just continue, and it's not acceptable at all, let alone sort of allowing it to happen. And while New Zealand is one of the least corrupt countries in the world, it's usually one or two on the scale, with Sweden, I think it is. We've had our recent examples here that sort of really shows that we've got to, while we might be one of the least corrupt countries in the world, we've got to work at it to make sure that continues that way.
Okay.
I gave you an example before we started this, in terms of a senior manager who basically didn't get anything signed off by anybody else further up the chain, and basically just walked away with $1 million. Now, organisations cannot afford to lose $1 million. But the rest of that story is interesting, because senior management, when they were told about it by people further down the chain who was sort of saying this is not good enough, ignored it, turned a blind eye, which is also not great and not good. So this particular person left the country, went overseas, came back, was arrested at the airport, and is now currently in jail. And the person, the chief executive who turned the blind eye, I should be careful what I say here, left the organisation and went to work for a government entity that's responsible for making sure that procurement is undertaken in the correct way, and was then fired. Well, yes, fired, yes. So, there are consequences. I talked before about consequences, and exactly. These were consequences, because it's the public sector can't afford. Well, nobody can afford, but the public sector cannot afford to lose $1 million that just walked out the door.
Oh, but Margaret, also, where is the borderline? I mean, if it would be $1,000, it would still be.
It doesn't matter whether it's $10, $1,000, $100,000, or $100 million or $10 million. The procurement principles, apply for across the whole gamut of expenditure levels.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, Margaret. I propose now to jump into the supplier perspective of this.
Yeah.
And as you said, being on the supplier side, it may look a little bit different, and maybe you can elaborate how it is, how this kind of behaviors is perceived, and what also triggers some suppliers to go into this mode.
Yeah, it is considered different, and sometimes there's no much thinking goes on at all, I have to say, on this, and they don't see that they're doing anything wrong. Now, in the New Zealand environment, is that suppliers often provide to buyers airfares and tickets to rugby union, which is our major sport here. I guess in your neck of the woods it would be football, sorry. And of course, that's not acceptable either. But there are some people who think that's okay, and there are some people like me who don't think it's okay. So if you're not straight and not clear about where you are, then how are poor suppliers supposed to know where they stand? So if it's a case of saying zero tolerance, which is where I come from, tolerance, then they shouldn't be, and they should be told that nothing is acceptable to be able to be given to a buyer.
Yeah.
But they sort of see cups of tea, and that happens in the New Zealand environment, Australian environment as well, as being okay. That's just doing friendly sort of buyer-supplier relationship stuff. And they don't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah, Margaret, I was struggling a long time with having the border, with understanding where the border is. But I remember now the good advice I was told by my colleagues about this borderline, that whatever can be achieved by a random person from the street, that is not considered as corruption. So, for example, if we are talking about the cup of coffee in my part of the world, when you arrive to the factory, or when you arrive to some meeting with supplier, and they're giving you, I don't know, some simple lunch or tea, coffee, things like that. If you are coming for the first time to this company as just like a buyer or seller or whoever, business partner, I mean, this is the behavior that you could expect. I mean, a cup of coffee is something that normally is given to any guest.
Yes.
And this is kind of okay.
Yes.
However, as an example of some very big discount or some big things for free, if I'm just coming to this company and saying hello, I want to talk to you or whatever, and you are not a part of this RFQ or whatever, you will never be proposed to have a free ticket to soccer or to rugby or something, So I think for me it was a good principle to follow. I mean, or the discount in the stores, for example, supplier, or I was working with a manufacturing a lot, and if you come to this manufacturing company and they say you can get some of our products with a discount like 50%, and you come in there is a store on their area, and you are coming and it looks really good, the offer looks really good, but the ordinary customer cannot get this discount of 50%. They have no discount, and this is beyond the border. This, you understand that for you it's a really special conditions, because just you are a very special guest. You are not the ordinary guest.
Sure. I think there are it depends on the circumstances, right? If you go for, your example was that you went into and met with the supplier, and it was for the first time, and they offered you tea or coffee, whatever. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. That's courtesy, that's whatever. But if they invite you out to a coffee place or whatever, and on a regular basis, and keep paying for that coffee or tea or whatever, then that's not okay. Those discounts that you've just been mentioning, that 50% discount, no, that's not okay. That's not normal sort of things, right? Unless it's agreed pricing and all the rest of it. And it depends on how it is presented, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think there's another aspect to all of this as well, is that if sort of If a supplier is providing money to the buyer to sort of win the contract, so to speak, that is not acceptable behaviour.
No. But this is already in legal field is not acceptable. I mean, there is also a part of our talk that we wanted to speak about the corruption and fraud, which is not only about the ethics, but also about the legislation and laws.
Sure, that example that I gave you before about this public servant who walked away with $1 million, that's way past unethical behaviour. That is procurement fraud. Yeah, so that's further down that continuum line. And then you get further down the line again to corruption in terms of, things that happen like we all know about that happen in some parts of Asia and Africa, for example. And having worked in Africa and having worked in Asia, it's the wording is interesting. They're not, sometimes people don't come out and actually say it as you and I probably would say it.
Okay.
But it's sort of different words that get used. And
For
I think
example,
there's been
it's what do you mean?
Well, it's facilitation payment as an example, right? Yeah, there's lots of words for it. And when I wrote the book, Contract Matters, Procurement and Ethics, I did a bit of research on all of this, and the actual words that get used instead of being what it is that you and I would say is quite interesting.
People try to make it sound better to have no conflict with their consciousness, or?
Yes.
Okay. Of course, you don't want to call it "let me give you a bribe," right? So, and I like your principle about zero tolerance. I was calling it in a different way, but it's like zero tolerance is a good word.
It's simple, isn't it? It's just really saying that none of the stuff is acceptable. Call it bribery, call it a facilitation payment, call it whatever any other word that gets used. None of it is acceptable. Because if we are true procurement people, and I'm a great believer in being a true procurement person, whether I'm a buyer or a supplier, and I've been both over the years, I'm now a supplier, you've got to behave in the right way. And if you are a buyer, you've really got to be clear as to what is acceptable and what is not, so that your suppliers are well aware of what is acceptable, what is not. I can give you another example. This sounds terrible. I've given you 2 examples from New Zealand just like that. Is that a few years ago, a public servant was offered a trip to London. Now, we're here in New Zealand, so going to London is a big deal, I have to tell you. Yeah. And they accepted that trip to London. Now, and then our environment, New Zealand environment of public service, I mean, you just about have to have permission to cross the road, let alone getting to a trip to London. Yeah. You know what I'm saying to you? So obviously that is, by that way, that person's no longer working in the public sector, because it's just, this was during a bid process, right? Nothing is acceptable.
I believe the flight ticket was a little bit more than $40. So.
Yes. Yes. Flight ticket to England from here is about 2,500 New Zealand dollars. But the principle is that you just can't behave in a way that sort of is just not right. And I don't believe that there is much difficulty in knowing what is right and what is wrong. I worked for the IMF in Washington DC for 2 years. The IMF stands for International Monetary Fund, and I had a supplier there who basically said to me when I arrived, "I'll do anything." And that is a bit creepy and a bit scary. And I thought to myself, I don't want to work with this person. I don't feel comfortable around this person.
Yeah.
If I don't accept cups of tea, which I don't, from suppliers, why would I? The concept of anything was sort of so out there that it made me very nervous.
Yeah.
Because you've got to be careful that your behaviour is seen to be pure, if that's the right word, and is transparent, and it is just so easy for you to, somebody to see something and misinterpret perhaps, or interpret correctly, and then where is your reputation then?
Yeah, that's a good one.
And to me that's important, to keep your reputation. And the other thing is, of course, in the New Zealand context, if it's very easy to land up on the front page of your local paper if something is done wrong.
Yeah.
Do you want to land up on the front page of your paper, newspaper? The answer to me would be no, you don't. And that's what happens in our environment anyway. I think suppliers are getting better, to be honest. I'll give them some kudos. I think they're getting better over the years and knowing that they shouldn't provide things, etc.
Yeah, but also, as you said, you have given two not really good examples from New Zealand, but still it's one of the least corrupted countries in the world.
Well, I can give you some good stories, as in the most of what happens here in my country is that procurement is done very well, and there are guidelines, and there is clarity around what is acceptable and what is not. There are, for the couple of occasions and what I've just mentioned to you, there are court cases, and the person who stole the $1 million is still in prison and won't get out for another 3-4 years or so. Yeah.
But
so
also what we said a little bit in advance before this record button was pushed is don't take it for granted. Don't take it for granted that if you have a good routines to avoid it, if you have a good signed documents and everything about preventing the corruption or about the unethical behaviors or code of conduct or whatever, don't take for granted that if people do it, they don't. Then you completely avoided all the risks connected to that.
And one thing that's a positive thing that you can do is that if you're going to sort of be out and about with suppliers, or the other way around with buyers, is have multiple people. So, the peer I was about to say peer pressure, but having peers around, will reduce the likelihood of any, anything occurring.
Yes, and one more aspect of that I wanted to raise, and maybe to also get your opinion from both supplier and buyer side. Mm-hmm. It's about we were talking a lot about this best practice about the supplier relationship management, and of course you should build a good, trustworthy relationship, but after some time it feels like you are too close to the people your contact person at supplier, and maybe even the top management of supplier or vendors that you meet on a regular basis, that you are getting familiar to them, that you are maybe even know a lot about their families and about their hobbies and things like that. And of course there is much easier, I mean, this border of being you are in this organization, I'm in this organization, is being diluted a lot. And then in such occasions I think it's much easier to get into this trap of accepting, let's say, many more things that would be unacceptable otherwise. Is it can you elaborate on that? I mean, how
I think from the buyer side of the fence is that, yes, it's good to have a good positive buyer-supplier relationship, but no matter how good it is, the buyer has to be able to take that step back and go, one day I might not need these goods or services anymore, so therefore might have to cancel the contract or not renew the contract. So there's got to be some sort of being able to take that step back and say, and so that that closeness doesn't happen to that degree. You know what I'm saying? So that, and I think from the supplier side is that they always welcome, of course, a positive buyer-supplier relationship. And I guess if you think that you're getting too close, then I think probably it's time to sort of request a new person or something like that. So especially from the buyer side, so that it is not sort of too close and all the rest of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in this perspective, the best practice is to have a planned rotation, even if you are having the same partners, business partners for a long time. I mean, the companies, if you have the same vendors for seems like forever,
Yes.
Still it's good to have new people working with them, not to really have this emotional connection as well.
Right.
Because then it, and I remember myself in these shoes, and I mean, it's nothing to say about the buyers or suppliers' behaviors that is bad or wrong or something, but it's natural human reaction for many of us to get connected in not only business manner, let's say, but also like emotionally or mentally with some people, and it would feel bad to discontinue the contract or to reduce the volumes or to give the contract to another company. So I would say that it's also like a part of unethical behavior, because unethical business behavior, let's say like this, because nevertheless it could be perfectly ethical from a human perspective. Like, you want to help to this person who is the CEO of the company, but of course from the business perspective it is no good if you are making decisions based on your emotional connection to the company.
I think, yes, I agree. The other thing you've got to remember is, of course, is that the contract is between two business entities. It's not between two separate people. And the people are agents, excuse this in terminology, are agents of the organisation, right? So the contract is a defining document and it's between two business entities. So you should never allow yourself to get that too closely aligned. Yeah.
However, we know that it happens, but yeah. I just say that we know that it happens. It sounds correct, but we know that it happens. And that's why, as I say, from the company perspective, you should know that it's no good, but it happens. And then how to prevent it, maybe it's good to have some rotation from time to time, with working with the same supplier, not more than, I don't know, 2 years is what we had by default in 2 of my companies where I was the head of procurement.
Yeah. Often what happens here in New Zealand is that, we have our monthly meetings with our suppliers and all the rest of it, which is back to the relationship stuff again. And it's usually in-house within the buyer organisation and, tea, coffee, whatever. But, again, that's just to sort of talk about issues and talk about work stuff and talk about, any problems, whatever. But the next time, and it has been known, is that, sometimes that meeting happens on the outside, so to speak. And I think if it's a case of one time the buyer buys the tea, coffee, whatever, and the next time the supplier buys the tea, coffee, whatever, that's okay. If it's always going to be one party, then that becomes, it's starting to have a bit of an inference behind it, if you know what I mean. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
That inference being is that we're doing this, and so therefore, this will provide future work for us or something like that. Yeah. It's that expectation, and that's what I'm saying. I said to you at the very beginning of this conversation about where is the line, and once you cross it, what does that mean, and how do you get back again? Cross that line back again, because once you've crossed it, it's pretty difficult to get back. And I never liked the idea of feeling like I was beholden to the other party. You know what I mean? I always like to be able to take that step back and go, okay, they are a supplier, and while I welcome what they do, and yes, we have a contract in place, whatever, and it's a bonus if it's a good relationship, I always knew as a buyer that one day I might have to walk away from this situation. So you want to be able to do that. Yeah. And, to be honest with you, Robert, this is simple. Don't accept anything, and then you don't have to think too hard about anything except for the work stuff.
Yeah. I like it. And that's, again, coming back to your zero tolerance.
Yeah, rule. Zero tolerance. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know people don't like the name and shame scenario, and I can understand why to a certain degree. But if we are serious about putting a stop to this, buyers do know suppliers out there and know, they keep it in their mind as to, okay, we're aware of their standing in the community, if we can use those words. And, so they won't ever go with those people. So that is kind of an unofficial name and shame kind of scenario. But there are some people who suggest that it should be on websites and stuff like that. Now, how far do you take it is another issue.
Yeah. What we had here in Europe, it is even a legal thing in many countries. For example, in the company, if there is a person who has done something particularly wrong, you cannot still make advertisement about that, or you cannot let everybody know that this and this person has done this and this is why he or she is fired.
Yes.
Because of the moral pressure to this person, and obviously there are different consequences for different people. Some of them can feel really terribly bad, and some of them can just be like indifferent.
I think work has to be put into, if we take Transparency International Index as an example, as to how we improve the worst corrupt countries in the world, and get them further up the line, so to speak, so that they can sort of stop being so poor when it comes to corrupt behaviour or fraudulent behaviour. And the problem is with some of those sort of countries is that it's not just procurement people that's like this, it's sometimes, and dare I say it, politicians.
Yeah.
So there is no sort of nothing coming from above, so to speak, to say what the acceptable behaviour is.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we said about leading by a good example. I mean, if the top management of the country, if I say like this, is behaving in unethical way, then I mean it just sets kind of the unwritten rules for entire country.
And there's some suggestion that some poor countries is that corruption happens because of low salaries and stuff like that. But if you look at the research shows that it's not always because of low salaries. So it's not like it's an economic reason for doing it, if you know what I mean. It's just a habit. Yeah. And also it's sort of like buying influence and stuff like that as well.
Right, and also what we said a little bit before we started this podcast, we also were talking about the long-term perspective of such behavior. We said that for both of the companies, in the long run, it is a lose-lose situation.
Yes, because
it is. On the short run, for me working for my procurement organization, if I take this bribe or if I take this, how did you call it, favor for?
Facilitation payment.
Facilitation payment. If I take this facilitation payment, it might seem fantastic for me in a short run, but in the long run, this kind of behavior can lead to, even if I would not be caught by this or have no legal consequences. I mean, for my company, I'm doing a bad favor. And for the company, for my vendor, I'm also doing a bad favor, because the vendor is losing the sense of competition and no really development, and it will become weaker over time. If I just purely think about some objective things, and then about the company that I'm working for as well, it loses in the long run, it will lose competition, it will lose the competence and expertise in the core areas, and of course this will lead to both companies losing. And then for me, taking this gift or this facilitation fee or whatever, in the short run, fantastic, but in the long run, I will lose anyhow. So,
well, I would like to just talk with you a moment about what you've just said in terms of, you say in the short term it's fantastic. I don't think in the short term it is fantastic, and I got to say I could never accept anything like that. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't live with myself. I don't think I could sort of.
Yeah, but for many people they can live.
Yeah, I know.
That's what I mean. That's where we started. What is ethical is a different perception for different people.
Yes. And I guess in some ways, once you've started, it's how do you get out of it then? Because, you know, you're really opening yourself up for some other things and blackmail type stuff if you've taken stuff, you know, and then you say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Well, you know, where does that lead you? as I said to you at the beginning, if you take a zero tolerance approach, then you've got no queries and no worries about anything in the future because you know that you've done things the right way. And I'm a great believer in following those procurement principles that are there for a reason. And that is ensuring that all procurement that's done is done in a transparent way. And I'm a great believer in the fact that there should be accountability. And if people do wrong things, then they should be dinged for them. I don't think it should be saying, oh, well, never mind. I think it actually has to be consequences attached to unethical behaviour. Now, that might make me sound like I'm a bit of an ogre, so to speak, but, well, I come from a country that's the least corrupt country in the world and frankly would like it to remain so. So we've got to work at it. So therefore, the zero tolerance approach should continue, shouldn't it? We've got to keep what we got. It's hard to drag it back. And since we're talking, and since the sessions have been about best practice, then you can't go past zero tolerance.
No, I think it's a main output of our conversation today for you, dear listener. I mean, if you are hesitating, if you are struggling with your consciousness, just this one phrase, zero tolerance, will help you a lot. And I think on this stage, Margaret, we can wrap up. Interesting topic in a way, but also very sad topic, we can say, because the fact is there that this kind of behavior still happens, and probably after this podcast is out in the world, it will still happen for some time.
Yes,
honestly,
it is sad, and it's also scary to think that they reckon that it's about $1 trillion a year goes in areas of corruption and stuff. That is scary to think, because can you imagine what that you could do with that $1 trillion?
Exactly.
So for the common good, and procurement should be for the common good, and especially in terms of public procurement, then think about what $1 trillion could do for a country's health system or education system. So really, corruption is a form of stealing, isn't it? Stealing from the population.
Exactly.
So, as a summary, I would suggest that we've got to be clear of how we undertake our procurement, and we should do things in the right way. So, and yes, it's a difficult one, Robert. I understand that, and maybe I'm sort of coming from a pure perspective and don't understand the nuances.
But it's how it should be. I mean, if we don't have this kind of pure perspective, then everything will become grey, and then everybody will decide. Yeah,
that's it. And since as procurement people we have to document everything we do in terms of procurement, then it is a black and white thing, because it is how we arrive at decisions, right?
Exactly. And
from the supplier side is that if you want to do future work with a buyer, then do things in the right way and don't offer goods and services during a bid process or any other time. And it wouldn't hurt to have suppliers to have a code of conduct for themselves, or at least be aware of the buyer's code of conduct. If you're a major supplier to a buyer of any kind, then be aware of that code of conduct.
Yes.
Since we're talking best practice here.
Great. I think you have given a great summary. I'm happy that you, Margaret, have raised this issue in our podcast once again. I'm sure that there will be a good discussion around it within our future procurement community, and I really hope for that, because the topic is not trivial. Thank you, Margaret, and to remind to all of us in future procurement that we need to create, or the vision that I had to create in this future procurement community was about creating the business confidence and strategic development approach for procurement professionals and organizations, and in such preconditions, of course, there is no place for unethical behaviors. I think this advice from Margaret about zero tolerance is something that we should keep for ourselves, to have a clear conscience and to have a good peace of mind, and also to have the better and more sustainable in the end society and all the world. With future procurement organization. So
we should be considering who we work for as well. Exactly. So we should be doing the best for our organisation, right?
Thank you, dear listeners, for being with us until the very end of this podcast episode. This was probably the longest podcast episode for future procurement and best practice. Thank you so much, Margaret, for sharing your thoughts and ideas around the ethical behavior in procurement and unethical behavior in procurement. And I strongly encourage you, dear listener, to raise this question in your procurement organization, with your management, with your colleagues and peers. Share this podcast episode with your friends and colleagues from procurement, from supply chain management, and I really wish that as many people as possible will get this message, these ideas that we were discussing today with Margaret. Of course, the question is very tricky and it requires a dialogue. We want to know what you think about this episode, so get in touch with us. My name is Robert Freeman, and this was Future Procurement. Talk to you soon.